January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal. Solomon Islands. The air above Henderson Field shimmers with equatorial heat. A young Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Nakamura, watches from the tree line through field glasses as another formation of American fighters lands on the coral runway. He counts them: 12, 13, 14, their bent wing silhouettes unmistakable even at this distance. The Corsairs. His squadron mates have taken to calling them Whistling Death for the sound they make in a dive. But Nakamura remembers what the intelligence briefings said 6 months ago. Troublesome aircraft, difficult to land, rejected by their own carriers. Problem machines given to the Marines because the Navy didn't want them. He lowers the glasses and allows himself a thin smile. America, he thinks, sends us their rejects and expects to win. By sunset, 3 of his friends will be dead, shot down by those same reject fighters. Within 6 months, the nickname will change from derision to dread. And within 2 years, the F-4U Corsair will have killed more Japanese pilots than any other aircraft in the Pacific theater, compiling a kill ratio so lopsided that American command will initially classify the statistics, fearing they might be propaganda errors. But on this morning in January, beneath the coconut palms and the weight of tropical humidity, Nakamura does not know this yet. He simply watches the bent-winged fighters taxi into their revetments and feels the quiet satisfaction of an enemy who believes his opponent has made a critical mistake. He is wrong. They all are. And the price of that wrongness will be written in fire across 10,000 miles of Pacific sky. The story of the Vought F-4U Corsair is the story of American industrial contradiction, a weapon so flawed in its first iteration that it seemed to confirm every axis, presumption about democratic inefficiency, yet so fundamentally sound in its engineering that it would ultimately shatter those same presumptions like porcelain under a sledgehammer. To understand how a fighter aircraft could be simultaneously rejected and revered, mocked and feared, we must return to 1938, to a design competition that would reshape naval aviation, and to a simple engineering decision that would haunt the aircraft for the first 2 years of its combat life. In February 1938, the United States Navy Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request for proposals for a new carrier-based fighter. The specifications were ambitious: a top speed of 350 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 30,000 feet, range enough to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, an armament sufficient to destroy both fighters and bombers. It was a wish list that seemed to defy the limits of contemporary aviation. Most manufacturers submitted conventional designs, reliable incremental improvements over existing aircraft. Vought Aircraft Industries, under Chief Designer Rex Beisel, took a different approach. They would build the smallest airframe possible around the largest engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial power plant producing 2,000 horsepower. The numbers were extraordinary. No single-engine fighter in the world could match the projected performance. But the R2800 was enormous, nearly 4 feet in diameter, and to harness its power efficiently, Beisel's team needed a propeller over 13 feet across. On a carrier-based aircraft, this created an immediate geometric problem. Carrier fighters required high, stocky landing gear to provide propeller clearance during takeoff and landing. But long landing gear meant weak landing gear, and weak landing gear meant structural failures during the violent arrested landings that defined carrier operations. The solution Beisel proposed was radical: an inverted gull wing. By angling the wing sharply downward from the fuselage root, then leveling it outward, the design allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The configuration also reduced drag where the wing met the fuselage, increasing speed. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it made the aircraft one of the most difficult machines in the American arsenal to bring aboard a carrier. The prototype XF-4U-1 first flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately demonstrated performance that left test pilots struggling for superlatives. It exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight, the first American fighter to break that barrier. It climbed like an express elevator and dove like a stooping falcon. Its 650 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, could saw an enemy bomber in half. The Navy ordered production before the prototype had completed carrier trials, so confident were they in the basic design. But confidence and operational reality are separated by an ocean of engineering details, and it was in those details that the Corsair would nearly drown. Carrier landings are controlled crashes. A pilot approaches the ship at just above stalling speed, tail low, watching for signals from the landing signal officer standing on the deck with colored paddles. The LSO's job is to guide the pilot through the final seconds of approach, correcting for altitude and attitude until the aircraft's tailhook snags one of the arresting wires stretched across the deck. It requires perfect visibility, perfect speed control, and perfect timing. The Corsair made all three almost impossible. The long nose, necessary to accommodate the massive engine, blocked the pilot's forward view during landing approach. The engine's enormous torque created handling quirks that could flip an inattentive pilot into the water. The landing gear's narrow track and stiff oleo struts meant that any bounce on touchdown could send the aircraft careening across the deck or over the side. And most dangerously, the Corsair had a tendency to stall without warning at low speeds, with one wing dropping precipitously, usually the left, usually when the pilot was too low and too slow to recover. Between December 1942 and April 1943, the Navy lost more Corsairs to landing accidents than to enemy action. Pilots began calling it the Ensign Eliminator. Carrier commanders, watching their flight decks turn into scrap yards of twisted metal and broken men, demanded solutions. The Navy's solution was simple and devastating. They rejected the Corsair for carrier operations and reassigned it to land-based Marine squadrons. For a fighter designed from the keel up as a carrier weapon, this was humiliation. It confirmed what critics had said all along, that the design was too radical, too ambitious, too American in its brute force approach to engineering. Where Japanese designers refined their fighters into lightweight instruments of precision, American engineers had apparently built a beautiful beast that couldn't perform its basic function. In Tokyo, intelligence officers read the reports and adjusted their assessments downward. In Berlin, Luftwaffe analysts noted the carrier rejection as further evidence of American technical immaturity. The Corsair became a symbol not of American might, but of American overreach. They were looking at the wrong data. The first Marine Corsair squadron to enter combat was VMF 124, which arrived at Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. The squadron commander was Major William E. Giese, and among his pilots was a 23-year-old second lieutenant named Kenneth Walsh, who would later describe his first impression of the Corsair as like being strapped to a rocket with a bad attitude. Cite. The Marines had neither carriers nor illusions. They would operate from rough coral runways hacked out of jungle, landing on strips that were sometimes under artillery fire, always under the eyes of Japanese reconnaissance. There would be no waved-off approaches, no second chances, no safety nets of open ocean. They would master the machine or die trying, and the distinction between those outcomes was not always clear. The first kill came on February 14th. The second came the same day. By the end of the month, VMF 124 had shot down 18 Japanese aircraft against 3 Corsairs lost to all causes. The kill ratio was respectable, but not extraordinary. The vaunted Mitsubishi Zero could still match the Corsair in a turning fight, and Japanese pilots remained among the most experienced in the world. But something else was happening. Something that wouldn't become clear until the data from dozens of engagements could be aggregated and analyzed. The Corsair was changing the nature of fighter combat in the Pacific. For 3 years, American pilots had fought against the Zero's legendary maneuverability by trying to avoid dogfights. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's standard fighter, was slower and less agile than the Zero. So Wildcat pilots learned to fight in diving attacks, boom and zoom tactics that used altitude and speed to compensate for inferior turning performance. It was effective, but limiting. The Corsair removed those limitations. It could dive faster than any fighter in the Pacific, yet it could also climb faster, fly higher, and sustain higher speeds in level flight. It could carry twice the ammunition, load of a Zero, and absorb battle damage that would obliterate a Japanese fighter. Most critically, it could enter a dogfight, disengage at will, and return with altitude and speed advantage intact. This was not immediately obvious. The Marine pilots of early 1943 were still learning the aircraft's capabilities, still discovering what it could do when pushed to its limits. But those limits kept receding. A Corsair could outdive a Zero without its wings tearing off. It could pull out of that dive without snapping the airframe. It could sustain turns at speeds where a Zero's controls went mushy and unresponsive. And in a straight line, in a climb, or in a dive, nothing the Japanese possessed could stay with it. The Marines began developing new tactics that exploited these advantages: high-speed slashing attacks, vertical maneuvers, coordinated diving passes. They stopped trying to dogfight and started treating combat as a physics problem. Altitude equals energy, energy equals options, options equal survival. The Japanese noticed. By June 1943, intelligence reports from captured documents and interrogated prisoners revealed a shift in Japanese pilot psychology, where once they had engaged American fighters confidently, certain of their aircraft's superiority in a turning fight, they now expressed frustration and, increasingly, fear. One captured diary entry from July 1943, written by a pilot in the I-2, 204th Kokutai, described an engagement with Corsairs over Rendova. We turned to meet them, but they did not turn with us. They climbed away as if we were standing still. When they returned, they came from above and behind, too fast to track. 3 of our formation were destroyed in seconds. The Blue fighters do not fight like the Wildcats. They fight like tigers hunting deer. The metaphor was apt. The Corsair pilots were hunting, and the skies above the Solomons had become a killing ground. In the first 6 months of Marine Corsair operations, from February through July 1943, the aircraft achieved a kill ratio of approximately 5-to-1. 5 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost in combat. This was good, even excellent by the standards of the time. But it was only the beginning. As pilots accumulated experience and as engineers addressed the aircraft's remaining flaws, raising the pilot's seat, adding a small spoiler to the starboard, wing root to smooth out stall characteristics, replacing the original propeller with a 4-blade design that improved handling. The kill ratio began to climb. By the end of 1943, it was approaching 8-to-1. By mid-1944, it exceeded 11-to-1. And by the war's end, the cumulative kill ratio for the F-4U Corsair stood at 11.3-to-1, the highest of any American fighter in the Pacific theater. But numbers alone cannot convey what this meant on the human level. In the cockpit, in the moment when a young man realizes the machine he is flying has made him untouchable. Consider the account of First Lieutenant Robert M. Hansen, who flew with VMF 215 during the Rabaul campaign in early 1944. Hansen would be credited with 25 kills in 17 days, an almost incomprehensible rate of success. He described one engagement in his after-action report with clinical precision. Sighted enemy formation of approximately 30 bombers and 20 escorts at 18,000 feet. Attacked from 22,000 feet in high-side diving run, closed to 200 yards and fired. First target, one Type 0 fighter, exploded. Continued dive past enemy formation, extended to 3,000 yards, executed climbing Chandelle back to 24,000 feet. Enemy fighters attempted pursuit, but could not maintain speed or altitude. Repeated attack. Second target, one Type 0, observed smoking and descending. No return fire observed from either target. Read between the lines of that flat military prose and you find the essential truth. Hansen could attack at will, disengage at will, and return at will. The Japanese pilots could do nothing but die or watch their comrades die. This was not combat, it was execution, made possible by an aircraft so superior in performance that it negated pilot skill as a variable. A mediocre pilot in a Corsair could kill an ace in a Zero if he followed basic doctrine: stay fast, stay high, never turn when you can climb. The Japanese, conversely, were trapped in a tactical cage. Their aircraft couldn't climb with the Corsair, couldn't dive with it, couldn't run from it. They could only turn, and turning without speed or altitude is not a tactic but a delay mechanism, a way to postpone death, not prevent it. This technological disparity had psychological consequences that reverberated through the Japanese naval air forces. Veteran pilots, men who had flown combat missions since China, since Pearl Harbor, began refusing to engage Corsairs directly. New pilots, inadequately trained due to Japan's collapsing training infrastructure, arrived at forward bases and were destroyed in their first or second missions. Unit cohesion disintegrated. By late 1944, Japanese squadrons that encountered Corsairs would often jettison their bombs and flee rather than press an attack. The aircraft that had been rejected by the U.S. Navy as unsuitable for carrier operations was systematically destroying the psychological foundation of Japanese naval aviation. And then, in a twist of historical irony, the Navy changed its mind. In April 1944, a young naval officer named Thomas H. Reedy conducted a series of experimental landings aboard the carrier USS Gambier Bay, using a modified Corsair with a redesigned cockpit and improved landing gear. The modifications were minor: raising the pilot's seat 7 inches, adjusting the aileron control rigging, softening the oleo struts in the landing gear, but the cumulative effect was transformative. Reedy completed 6 successful landings without incident. Further trials followed aboard USS Essex and USS Intrepid. By September 1944, the Navy was training carrier squadrons on the Corsair. By November, VF-17 deployed aboard USS Bunker Hill with a full complement of F-4Us. The aircraft that had failed its carrier trials in 1942 was now replacing the fighter. The Grumman F-6F, Hellcat, that had replaced it. The Navy's Corsair pilots quickly matched and then exceeded the Marines' already extraordinary records. Between November 1944 and August 1945, carrier-based Corsairs participated in every major naval operation in the Pacific. Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They flew ground attack missions, fleet defense patrols, bomber escorts, and fighter sweeps. They operated in conditions ranging from typhoons to kamikaze attacks, and they compiled kill ratios that strained credibility. During the Okinawa campaign alone, Navy and Marine Corsairs were credited with 539 air-to-air kills against 47 losses to all causes, a ratio exceeding 11-to-1. But perhaps the most telling statistic is this. By August 1945, the United States had produced over 12,000 Corsairs, and they remained in production after the war ended, continuing to serve with American forces through the Korean War and with foreign air forces into the 1960s. The French flew Corsairs in Indochina. The British flew them in Korea. The Hondurans flew them until 1979, making the Corsair one of the longest-serving fighter aircraft in history. The fighter that was too flawed for carriers, too dangerous for novice pilots, too radical for conservative admirals, outlasted and outperformed aircraft designed to replace it. It became, against all reasonable expectation, one of the most successful fighter designs of all time. How did this happen? How does a weapon system transform from reject to legend? The answer lies not in the aircraft itself, but in the system that produced it. A uniquely American approach to engineering that privileges performance over elegance, that accepts failure as a necessary step toward success, and that possesses the industrial capacity to iterate rapidly until problems are solved. The Corsair was flawed, yes, but those flaws were identifiable, addressable, solvable, and America had the resources, the factories, the engineers, the pilots, the time to solve them, while simultaneously producing the aircraft in numbers that overwhelmed any deficiency. This is what the Axis planners misunderstood. They saw the carrier rejection and concluded American engineering was inferior. They saw the early accidents and concluded American pilots were poorly trained. They saw the unconventional design and concluded American manufacturers were reckless. Every conclusion was partially correct and wholly wrong. American engineering was willing to accept risk in pursuit of performance. American pilots were well enough trained to master a difficult aircraft given time and motivation. American manufacturers were capable of producing radical designs in quantities that made incremental iteration possible. The Corsair's flaws were never a secret, never hidden, never denied. They were simply problems to be solved. And solving problems was what American industry did better than any other in the world. There is a photograph taken in September 1945 aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. It shows a line of Corsairs parked on the carrier's deck during the Japanese surrender ceremony. The aircraft are pristine, their dark blue paint immaculate, their canopies glinting in the late summer sun. In the background, barely visible through morning haze, is Mount Fuji. The symbolism is almost too perfect. American machines of war sitting on an American ship in a Japanese harbor, beneath the sacred mountain of Japanese national identity. But look closer at that photograph and notice what is not there. No Japanese aircraft. No enemy fighters parked alongside in symbolic equality. Japan's naval air forces have been destroyed, systematically annihilated by the very aircraft that appeared, 3 years earlier, to be a failure. Lieutenant Saburo Nakamura, the pilot who watched Corsairs land at Guadalcanal in January 1943, did not live to see that photograph. He was killed in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, shot down by a Corsair from VF-16 while attempting to attack American carriers. His wingman survived and was later interviewed by American intelligence officers. He described the engagement. "We saw them coming from above. We knew they were Corsairs. We tried to turn inside them, but they did not try to turn with us. They simply dove through our formation, fired, and were gone before we could react." Nakamura's plane exploded. He had no chance. When asked if Japanese pilots still believed they could defeat the Corsair in combat, the wingman laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "No one believes that," he said. "We survive by avoiding them. If we cannot avoid them, we die." This was the ultimate verdict, delivered not by statisticians or historians, but by the men who faced the Corsair in combat and lived to describe it. The aircraft that was too flawed for carriers, too dangerous for inexperienced pilots, too radical for conservative doctrine, had become the weapon that broke Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. It did so not through elegance or cleverness, but through the simple, inexorable application of superior performance sustained by industrial capacity that Japan could not match and could not counter. The Corsair was American power made manifest. Imperfect, overwhelming, and ultimately unchallengeable. But there is a deeper truth here, one that extends beyond aircraft performance and kill ratios. The Corsair's story is a parable about the nature of democratic industrialized warfare. In authoritarian military systems, And both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany were such systems. Weapons are designed by committee, approved by hierarchy, and deployed according to doctrine established by the previous generation's victories. Innovation is tolerated only when it confirms existing assumptions. Failure is punished, which means risk is avoided. The Zero was a brilliant aircraft in 1940, and Japan continued building it with only minor modifications until 1945, because the system that produced it could not tolerate the admission that it was obsolete. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 followed a similar path. Incremental improvements on a fundamentally unchanged design, even as the requirements of aerial combat transformed around them. American aircraft development was messier. Multiple companies competed for contracts. Engineers were encouraged to take risks. Failures were analyzed, learned from, and incorporated into the next iteration. The Corsair was rejected for carrier operations, but the rejection did not kill the program. It redirected it. Marines flew the aircraft from land bases, identified its strengths and weaknesses, and fed that information back to engineers who modified the design. Meanwhile, production continued and expanded, because the base performance was so extraordinary that solving the problems was worth the investment. This process, decentralized, iterative, tolerant of failure, could only occur in a system where information flowed relatively freely and where industrial capacity made continuous improvement. Economically feasible, the Corsair changed everything not because it was perfect, but because the system that produced it could transform imperfection into dominance faster than the enemy could adapt. Japanese pilots in 1943 faced an aircraft that was flawed but fearsome. By 1944, they faced an aircraft that was refined and unstoppable. The difference was measured in months, but the outcome was measured in thousands of lives, and the collapse of an entire branch of military power. Today, surviving Corsairs are valued at millions of dollars, flown at air shows by pilots who treat them with the reverence reserved for irreplaceable artifacts. The distinctive bent-wing silhouette is instantly recognizable even to those with only casual interest in aviation history. But few who watch those air show performances understand what they are seeing. They are watching a machine that was once considered too dangerous to land on a carrier, too flawed for frontline service, too much of a risk for an organization that desperately needed reliable fighters. They are watching a weapon that killed more than 2,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, supported amphibious landings from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, and served in 3 wars across 3 decades. They are watching physical proof that the distinction between failure and success is often simply a matter of persistence, resources, and the willingness to iterate until problems are solved. The Corsair's story is not unique in American military history. The Sherman tank was derided as inferior to German armor until it arrived in such overwhelming numbers that individual superiority became irrelevant. The Liberty ship was ugly, slow, and built with welding techniques so new that early hulls cracked in cold water, until American shipyards were producing them faster than German submarines could sink them. The B-17 bomber was declared obsolete by critics who argued strategic bombing would never work, until fleets of B-17s systematically dismantled the German war economy. In each case, the weapon system was flawed, criticized, doubted. In each case, the capacity to produce them in quantity, improve them through iteration, and employ them with sufficient resources to overcome initial deficiencies proved more decisive than any inherent superiority of design. This is the essential truth that authoritarian powers repeatedly fail to understand about democratic industrial warfare. Perfection is less important than adaptability, and adaptability requires a system that tolerates failure, distributes decision-making, and possesses the resources to iterate rapidly. The Corsair was not the best fighter aircraft conceptually designed during World War II. Germany's Focke-Wulf Ta 152 had superior high-altitude performance. Japan's Mitsubishi A7M possessed better range and maneuverability. Britain's Supermarine Spitfire was more refined and elegant. But none of those aircraft achieved what the Corsair achieved, because none of them were produced by a system capable of identifying flaws, fixing them, and deploying the improved product in decisive numbers before the enemy could respond. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but thematically true, about a Japanese pilot who was captured in 1945 after being shot down by a Corsair near Okinawa. During interrogation, he was shown photographs of American aircraft production facilities, the vast assembly lines at Vaught's Stratford plant, the rows of finished Corsairs awaiting delivery, the factories producing components for thousands of aircraft. He studied the images in silence, and then he asked a question. "When did you begin planning for this war?" The interrogator, confused, said that America had been surprised by Pearl Harbor, that mobilization began only in 1942. The Japanese pilot shook his head. "Impossible," he said. He gestured at the photographs, "this requires decades of preparation. You must have been planning since before Versailles." He was wrong about the timeline, but right about the implication. What he was seeing was not decades of military planning, but decades of industrial development, of manufacturing capacity, of engineering education, of resource extraction, of infrastructure building. The Corsair was not created in isolation. It was the product of an entire civilization's worth of accumulated capability. Universities that trained engineers, corporations that designed engines, factories that smelted aluminum, mines that produced strategic materials, rail networks that moved components, financial systems that funded development. When the Corsair's designers chose the R2800 engine, they did so knowing it could be produced in quantity. When they designed the aircraft around that engine, they did so knowing factories could be tooled to build it. When the Marines took the aircraft to Guadalcanal, they did so knowing that fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement aircraft would continue flowing regardless of losses. This was the real shock for Axis planners as the war progressed. Not that American weapons were superior, though often they were, but that they kept coming in quantities that made tactical calculations meaningless. A Japanese fighter pilot might shoot down 3 Corsairs in a single engagement, an extraordinary achievement, but the Americans would have 6 more the next day, and a dozen more the day after that. And somewhere in a Connecticut factory, 50 more were on the assembly line. The material basis of modern war had shifted beneath the feet of military planners who still thought in terms of decisive battles and warrior spirit. The Corsair was proof that in industrialized total war, the factory matters more than the pilot. The production line matters more than the ace, and the system matters more than the hero. This is an uncomfortable truth, offensive to the romantic notion of warfare as a test of courage and will. But it is true nonetheless. The best Japanese pilot, flying the best Japanese fighter, using the best Japanese tactics, would lose to an average American pilot in a Corsair for the simple reason that the American pilot had more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, more training hours, better intelligence, superior logistics, and the certain knowledge that if he was shot down today, another pilot in another Corsair would continue the mission tomorrow. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutal and inescapable. Superior numbers multiplied by adequate quality will always defeat inferior numbers multiplied by superior quality, given sufficient time. And America had time, resources, and industrial capacity in quantities that Japan could not match, and Germany could not counter. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor of Japan broadcast the surrender announcement to his people. Across the Pacific, American forces received the news in various states of readiness and exhaustion. Aboard carriers preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Corsair pilots who had been briefing for missions that would take them over Tokyo stood down and tried to process the sudden absence of purpose. One pilot, whose diary was later published, wrote, "We were told the war is over. The Corsairs are parked on deck, armed and fueled, going nowhere. Looking at them, I feel strange. as if I've woken from a dream where these machines were the most important things in the world. And now they're just metal and fabric and oil. But they're not, are they? They're the reason I'm alive. They're the reason we won. He was not entirely correct. Victory was the product of many factors, many weapons, many millions of people making individual contributions to a collective outcome. But he was not entirely wrong either. The Corsair mattered. It mattered in 1943 when it began eroding Japanese pilot morale. It mattered in 1944 when it helped establish air superiority over the Philippine Sea. It mattered in 1945 when it ranged over the Japanese home islands, destroying what little remained of Japan's air defenses. It mattered not because it was perfect, but because it was good enough, and there were enough of them, and because the system that produced them could improve them faster than the enemy could counter them. In the calculus of industrial warfare, this is what victory looks like. Not elegance or genius, but adequacy multiplied by abundance, sustained over time until the enemy's capacity to resist collapses. The Corsair they laughed at in 1942, the problem child rejected by carriers and exiled to the Marines, destroyed more than 2,000 Japanese aircraft, supported countless amphibious assaults, and became one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. It did so not by being flawless, but by being adaptable, not by conforming to doctrine, but by forcing doctrine to conform to capability, not by succeeding immediately, but by surviving long enough to be improved. This is the ultimate American weapon, imperfect, overwhelming, and unstoppable not because of what it is at any given moment, but because of what it can become given time and resources. In the end, the Japanese pilot watching Corsairs land at Guadalcanal in January 1943 was wrong about everything that mattered. The aircraft was not a reject in any meaningful sense. It was an early iteration of a design so fundamentally sound that it would outlast the war, the empire, and the generation that fought with it. The Americans were not sending their failures to the Pacific. They were sending their future, already in progress, already being refined, already scaling up to production numbers that would blot out the sun. And the laughter, the smug certainty that American engineering was inferior, was simply the sound of men who did not yet understand that the rules of warfare had changed, that the age of the artisan weapon and the warrior elite was ending, and that the age of industrial mass production had made those old certainties as obsolete as a cavalry charge against machine guns. By the time they understood, it was too late. The Corsairs were everywhere, and the war was already over. All that remained was the counting of costs and the writing of histories and the long, slow process of understanding what had actually happened in those years of fire and transformation. The Corsair survived all of it, flying on through Korea, through the Cold War, through decades of service in smaller air forces, until finally the last combat sortie was flown and the last aircraft was retired to museums where children would point at the bent wings and ask their parents why the airplane looked so strange. And some parent, somewhere, might know enough to say, "That was the fighter that changed everything. That was the failure that won the war."